So if you're a local drug action team that feels you have a really good grasp on who the media is, why you need the media, and how it is that you want to work with them, the next steps are really, really important. So we'll ask a couple of questions of each other to see how you can develop those relationships and get the stories that you want. So, first question for Jill. For people running community programs, it's hard to know what would be of interest or not to a journalist like yourself. What are the key elements that you look for that make a good story?
It's a good question. There's a number of things that we'd look for. Firstly, you've got to ask yourself, is this new? What is the new element to the story that you're pitching to the journalists? Like, we're so busy, we are bombarded with press releases and people pitching stories to us. So you've got to ask yourself, what's the new angle? How can you make it fresh? So that's a really important one to remember. The other thing that I always tell people when you're pitching this story, the number one question to ask yourself is, why should they care? So the audience that you're trying to reach beyond this journalist, the audience that's out there, why should they care about what it is that you're trying to say? And normally the answer to that question comes back to human stories. It really does.
The amount of times that I've had a journalist say to me, I've come in with, oh, we've got X amount of funding, we've got this great program, and before I can finish, the journalist is saying, so who have you got to talk about it? Have you got a family? Have you got somebody who's experienced it? Have you got a community member? And sometimes I'll say, oh, I've got my CEO or I've got my state manager. And there's generally a bit of a blank. They want real people.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to think about it from you as a viewer or a reader. What do you really connect with? What are you interested in? Is it a man in a suit telling you about how much money that they're spending on an initiative? Or is it the mother who can tell the story about her child, or the grandparent? Like that's what you have to keep in mind, is that it really is about those human stories, and that's what will help to promote your message.
And finding those human stories are really hard. Like, particularly, for what I do with the Alcohol and Drug Foundation, getting people to talk about their experience with drugs and alcohol is really hard. And there's a concern, particularly for me, when I'm talking to, families that have experienced losing a loved one or have themselves been through drug dependency. They're worried about how the media is going to portray them. So it's good to hear that you say you need human stories, but how is it that somebody like me or a local drug action team can make sure that their spokespeople are protected and that their story isn't, portrayed in an untasteful way, distasteful way?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real concern. I understand that people will be nervous about putting themselves out there, particularly when it's a personal and sensitive story. But generally, journalists are pretty responsible, and when it comes to sensitive stories like that, it's not in anyone's interest to trip people up or make them look foolish or not treat them well. I think often it comes with you just preparing that person as well as possible for dealing with the journalist, giving the journalist as much background information as possible. You can even ask the journalist if it's a particularly sensitive story. Generally, they won't give you copy approval where you get to read the story beforehand, but they may be willing to read to you over the phone what quotes they're going to use from that person, and I think that's a fair enough thing to ask when you're asking someone to put a very personal question, a very personal story out there.
So if you're looking for the human factor really is what you're saying, and you're looking for somebody to talk to their experience with alcohol and drugs, if you can't get somebody that's had, first-hand experience with the issue, what's the next source or the next spokesperson that you might look for that could tell that story that you'd be interested in?
So if it's not the person themselves, then perhaps it could be someone who works in that area. Maybe there's a paramedic, or maybe somebody at the local health centre, or someone who can tell the story on behalf of those people. So again, it's someone who has first-hand experience of working with people who are affected by this issue. And there's a lot of people out there that deal with that, who you will know in your own local communities, that can tell the stories that you need to bring that issue to life.
I've just remembered something. I remember when I pitched a story to you once.
Oh, wow.
And I told you the story, I gave you the pitch, and you're like, so what's new? And I was like, oh, this is new. And you were like, so what's the new research? And I was like, oh, I don't think I've got any new research or new evidence. And the story just fell over, right? So how important is it that local drug action teams bring to the table something that's new in terms of facts or stats or...
It's a really important thing, is to have something new and fresh to bring to the table, particularly when it comes to the issue of drugs. That we hear a lot of stories around drug use, drug harm, and if it's just the same story told in a different area, it's not really going to get any cut through. So if go to the people in your local drug action teams, find out what the stats are on the ground, what are the emerging trends, what are the demographics of the people that you're seeing, the ages, are there any sort of ways into it that can just provide that little bit of a new angle that's enough to get a journalist's attention. It doesn't have to be huge, it doesn't have to be, massive amount of stats, just something, a way into the story that is new, which will allow that journalist to go to their editor and say, this is what's new, because the journalist who's asking you that question, Ilka, is asking you the question that they're going to be asked by their editor to try and get that story over the line to get it published.
I know some people get concerned about how pushy is too pushy in terms of pitching a story. What's the preferred process? Do media prefer to have the pitch put in email, phone, or social media if they at them? And if we don't hear anything, can we follow up? And how long do you wait before following up? And those last two parts of this question are really important for me, because I will send out an email, say to yourself, and then an hour goes past, 2 hours goes past, and I'm like, do I wait for you or do I go to another journalist? And then I get worried that if I go to another journalist, you might pick up the email and then I've passed it off to another journalist. Like it's a really big juggling act.
It's a difficult balancing act. But I think what you have to remember is that in normal life, what we as journalists call civilian life, outside of newsrooms, being pushy is generally seen as a no-go area, but in journalism, that's the only way you're going to get through to an editor or to get your story across. So actually being a little bit pushy might seem, something that makes you a bit uncomfortable, but if you want that story to be told, it's really important that you actually get the journalist's attention.
And I think it's a little bit different sometimes with regional and rural versus metropolitan and suburban. So if I'm in a small community, I might actually know the journalist. So sending an email might be a little too formal. So you probably just call them and say, hey, I'm about to flick you an email. Are you at your desk or are you working today? Because sometimes journalists aren't even working that day, right? So is to approach it that way. And also, if you've got a good relationship with the journalist, then you can send the email, flick them a text. Hey, just sent you an email. Yeah. It's a story, I want to give you guys as a scoop, but let me know by the end of today if you're interested or not.
Yeah, it's about having those relationships and building that trust, isn't it?
Are there any examples that you can give me which are like really bad don'ts that you may have opened up your email and gone, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that they've done this? Like some good tips and tricks.
Yeah, so I think one that happens quite routinely, which annoys journalists a lot, is when we get organisations who think that we're there to provide free advertising for them. It's not our job to do PR for your organisation. Our job is to tell a story to the public, and we have to think about the public's best interest, not the best interest of the company or the organisation. So a good example of that would be, I would, as a health reporter, routinely get emails from people, and they would often conceal who they were working for. So it might be, we've got this great new research on how porridge is good for your brain or good for your heart or whatever. And then you'd call the PR person and find out that they actually worked for a leading cereal company or an oats company. And so they're really, that's not a lot of news value in that. What I would then say is I would refer them to our advertising department, because it's not actually news, it's advertising.
I was just having a memory of, and this happened a couple of times when I was a journalist, is that I received an email that I had clearly seen that they just changed the name.
Oh, that's the worst.
So that they've sent it to a whole bunch of other people, and all they've done is change the name. It's come up in a different colour or a different font. So, just to make sure that if you are sending the same email to a couple of journalists, is make sure there's some continuity in the email so it doesn't look like you're sending it to everybody else. And then the other one that I've experienced is in the media releases, where I've opened up the media release and I've seen the track changes. So if you're going to send a media release out, make sure you PDF it and attach it. So that way nobody can actually ever see your issues management or what you've deleted and added to, give a certain spin.
It has happened to me before where I received an email that said, "Hi Jill," and this is when I was working for The Age. "We've got this great story that we think would be fantastic for the Herald Sun." And so I emailed back to the reporter and said, "That's great. I suggest you call the Herald Sun and pitch it to them." And it's just simple things like that that can really can sink your story like a stone. So just double check what you're sending out.
Who you're sending it to, make sure the font's consistent, make sure that you don't have any track changes in the media release.
And get their names right.
So
a question for you, Ilka. We've obviously got a lot of different mediums. There's TV news, there's radio, there's digital, there's print. Like, how do you know which one to use and when?
It's a good question. So I think it's really important to have a look at what you've got. So if you're a local drug action team that has a program that focuses on keeping young people in school, because we know that is a great protective factor in terms of somebody picking up a drink dependently later on in life, that if you can actually get vision of the school and the children at the school that you might be focusing on, then that's great. Then you could probably go to a TV story. But you might encounter some issues because generally speaking, getting shots of children is very, very difficult. So it actually might be more of a print story, because if you can't get vision, or what we call overlay vision, then you might be able to get a shot of a principal and one or two children because you've got the permission from their parents. So it's, again, it really depends on what you've got. And I think the way that you talk to the journalist is also very, very different if you're doing, say, for radio news grabs, so that's for the news bulletins, then you've got to make sure that what you're saying is short, sweet, snappy, 10-second sentences at the very most. And then if you're looking at a radio program, so you're being interviewed by an announcer, that's a great opportunity to really take a deep dive into the issue of drugs and alcohol and talk more elaborately and more detail around the program that you're running. It's not the opportunity you're going to get if you're doing it for radio news grabs. And then if you're doing commercial television, so if it's Win or Prime, if you're in the regional and rural areas, if it's Channel 7 in the metro areas, it doesn't matter. It is literally, 7 seconds at the most. If you're saying something extremely interesting, which, sometimes that isn't the case, it will be maximum 10 seconds. So, but then if you're, being interviewed by a print journalist like yourself, Jill, then it's a little bit more like the program radio interview. You've got time to go in, discuss the issue, because they're looking for quotes anyway, and they can be long or short. So the different mediums, yes, they do depict what you can say, what images, what vision. It's just really looking at the very first instance, what have you got? Have you got somebody to talk? Are they happy to talk to TV? Are they happy to get their photo taken? If they're not, well, maybe it's a radio story. So it's about weighing all those things up.
Sometimes it might be a story for all of the media.
Yeah. And I think that's when you know you've got all the winning bits. You've got a great lead, you've got great spokespeople, you've got great case studies. I know how much you guys love case studies, some good statistics. So, yeah, absolutely agree. And then a lot of the stories can actually go out to everyone. If you're not sure, well, then send it to everybody. So hopefully Jill and I have given you an understanding about how you can develop those relationships with journalists and what it is that they need, and it seems like they need a lot.
We do.
Very needy individuals. But there's also a very important piece, which is how do you harness those relationships long term and really understanding where you go with each particular story. So it's not stressful talking to the media, that it's just part of your job as a local drug action team. So we will create another video for that.